In 2008, Shaun Haney started RealAgriculture.com as a hobby that has turned into a dream come true. Getting a chance to see agriculture across Canada, talking to leading farmers and industry stakeholders from all facets of agriculture, Shaun considers himself a pretty lucky guy. Along with writing for RealAgriculture.com, he also hosts RealAg Radio on Rural Radio 147 Sirius XM every weekday at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And today, RealAg Radio has come to AgEx. Take it away, Shaun.
Thanks for that great intro. Really do appreciate it. It's great to be here at the Agricultural Excellence Conference, AgEx. Really do appreciate it, you having me a part of your agenda today. You know, I feel so fortunate to be able to speak to farmers and ranchers across this country every single day on Rural Radio 147. And I know we've got a lot of big fans of real agriculture out there today as delegates attending this conference virtually. And I really do appreciate you having us here. It means a lot. And I know there's a lot of things on your plate. You know, there's been some challenges across the country, right? We've had drought out west. We've had a challenging harvest in parts of Eastern Canada. Of course, you've seen what some of our farming peers have gone through when it comes to British Columbia. And there's the production side of that, but there also then is the farm management side of it. And agriculture is never short of challenges. And so you can kind of feel like you're kind of alone trying to manage your business at times. And so the conferences like this really allow you to up your game, learn new skills, maybe share some of your experience with some of your peers and realize everybody's really going through some of the same stuff. We figure that out every week on the Farmer Rapid Fire on RealAg Radio as we talk to farmers from across the country, and they tell us about what they're kind of going through, what their challenges are, the decision making they're having to do, and you find out that there's a lot of similarities from coast to coast here in the Canadian market. So what you're going to see here is an actual broadcast of our show, RealAg Radio, that you can hear every weekday, 4:30 Eastern. That's 2:30 Mountain, maybe 3:30 Central, depending on which time zone you're in. And it broadcasts on Rural Radio 147 on Sirius XM. Okay. Now, this show is broadcasting here today on this Thursday on U.S. Thanksgiving. But the other part is if you ever miss any of these shows, you can also download the podcast. And so we also podcast the show, so you don't need a SiriusXM subscription to hear the show. So hopefully if you haven't been able to listen to the show because you're like, I don't have Sirius, we definitely provide you with that option. You can go to realagradio.com to find out more or download the podcast from anywhere that you get your podcast. Like I said, farm management is something that I think is... It's under discussed. You know, we tend to focus a lot on agronomy and machinery, and obviously there's ag policy, but there's farm management. And so I'm super excited to be a part of today's agenda to try to bring some of these items to light, and not just for you, the audience here today at AgEx, but also the entire RealAg Radio audience that's listening across North America. So once again, thank you for having me here today at this conference. Big thanks to RBC Royal Bank for being today's show sponsor, as you're going to hear throughout the show. We got a great lineup for you. So let's not waste any more time. Let's get to it. Here is a live version, so to speak, of RealAg Radio from the Ag Excellence Conference. Enjoy, everybody. It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio. Welcome to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio 147 on Sirius XM. Shaun Haney, your host here on this Thursday, U.S. Thanksgiving edition of the show. Thanks so much for making RealAg Radio and Rural Radio 147 a part of your workday, and a big shout out to all of you listening on the RealAg Radio podcast. Today is a special show. Not only is it U.S. Thanksgiving, and I'm really super jealous about all the turkey that all of our U.S. listeners are going to be having, but also in Canada today, it is Farm Management Canada's Ag Excellent Conference, and we are broadcasting from AgEx here today, and our sponsor is RBC Royal Bank. Big shout out to RBC Royal Bank for being on board with today's sponsorship And we very, very much appreciate RBC Royal Bank, also a sponsor of our Mind Your Farm Business podcast that you can find at mindyourfarmbusiness.com. So a lot to discuss here today on the program. Really looking forward to it. Our lineup is all dedicated to farm management topics. We're going to be hearing today from Shaun Haas of RBC Dominion Securities based out of Lethbridge, Alberta. We're going to talk about how concerned should you be as a farm or ranch owner in Canada about inflation. We're hearing so much about inflation right now. It's all over the news, but what does it actually mean for my farm business? So we'll talk about that. And maybe also, where should I be parking some of my dollars? If I got some money set aside, is it best to keep pumping it into land, or is it to try to diversify some of my assets as well? So we'll get some insights from Shaun on that. We're going to hear from Ryan Reese of RBC Royal Bank. He's got some breaking news, a big announcement today. First time you'll ever hear about it will be here today on this program. So looking forward to that for sure. And then we're going to finish up today's show talking about a topic that, quite frankly, it continues to be one of the biggest threats to agriculture. And that's not poor trade agreements. That's not market access. That's not trying to find financing. That's not all the other things you run into, human resource, finding labor. One of the biggest threats to farms in North America, quite frankly, in Canada and the U.S., is farm succession. And it continues to be a problem, continues to be a challenge. Now, that doesn't mean that it's an obstacle that we can't overcome. Of course we can do it. And we're going to learn today about some of the things that we need to consider if we are going to engage in this process, how to make sure it runs as smoothly as it possibly can. Our guest is Renee Wyatt. She's a research and extension specialist at Purdue University with their Purdue Institute for Family Business. So looking forward to talking to Renee. It's the first time she's been on RealAg Radio, and so we are definitely going to have some fun chatting with her. Whether you're at the Ag Excellence Conference or you're listening on Rural Radio 147, you can definitely send me your feedback. I want to hear from you. It could be on farm management topics, or it could be on anything else that's kind of a bit of a burr under your saddle and you got an opinion on it. Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com, or of course you can find us on social media. At Real Agriculture is our username, whether we're on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We are Real Agriculture, so find us at any of those applications. Or you can call the Real Ag listener line. Why not do that? The best part here is you dial a number, you press the number 3, and you leave me a message, and maybe we can play some of them on the air. Sounds like a pretty good deal. 855-776-6147. As I said today, we are at the Agricultural Excellence Conference with Farm Management Canada. And, farm management is something that I think we don't work on enough. And that may seem kind of strange to you. What do you mean, Shaun? I go to lots of conferences, and there's somebody speaking about how to find good labor, how to manage employees, how to maybe put together like a strategic plan, operational plan, and then I'll do all that work and I'm just a victim to the weather anyway. And some of that may be true, but I really think that this is one of the areas where we really, really can do some really increase what our businesses look like over the long term from a profitability standpoint. There's always going to be variables thrown our way that are totally out of our control, but there's some things in our control that I think we can really, really raise the tide, so to speak, when it comes to managing our farm business. This is why I believe so much in our Mind Your Farm Business podcast. That's why I believe so much in conferences here like the AgEx conference. And it's great to see all of you from across the country trying to make your farm businesses and ranches even better than they already are. And it's great to be aboard today on the agenda. Big thanks to RBC Royal Bank for being today's show sponsor. When we come back on RealAg Radio, we're going to talk to Shaun Haas of Dominion Securities right after this. And welcome back to RealAg Radio, broadcasting today from the Ag Excellence Conference, brought to you by Farm Management Canada. Great to be here today, here on SiriusXM at this show. Today's show, of course, brought to you by RBC Royal Bank. Big thanks to them for their sponsorship today at the Ag Excellence Conference. Let's get to our first guest here on the show. It is Shaun Haas of Dominion Securities, RBC Dominion Securities, based in Lethbridge, Alberta. Hey, Shaun, how are you?
Good, really good. Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, important topic, I think, because you turn on Bloomberg, you turn on CNBC, Fox Business, and really maybe even the like the nightly news. All everybody's talking about is inflation. So, from your perspective, as a farmer or rancher, and you've got a lot of ag clients, how worried should farmers and ranchers be about inflation?
Well, in some ways, I think your farmers are probably in a lot of ways set up to benefit from the trend of inflation. I mean, what are the two biggest assets of most farmers? Well, they're producing commodities and they've got a lot of real estate, which are, if we look at inflation, those are typically two areas that tend to run counter to inflation. So I say that, but I mean, I know there's more to it. There is other factors that need to be looked at. So I do think, though, that we are seeing an increase. I just talked to a client today who mentioned that their fertilizer price went from $675 to like $1,200 for next year. So you really have to start to pay attention to those kind of increases, right, that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about where you should put your money here in a second, but when I think about this, I think there's a lot of people concerned that the money I made or didn't make in some cases in the drought zone, but the money that I have in my bank account today is worth less than it was, say, 3-4 months ago. And the inflation that we're seeing, it's hard to get your head wrapped around the impact because, when you think about high inflation, you think about other countries around the world, Argentina, right? Like huge inflation. They wish they had our inflation. So when we hear numbers like 3%, I think this last week it was 4.7%, like historically, are those numbers where people are like, ooh, this is a problem? Are these numbers to get excited about?
I do think that we are seeing some numbers right now that are getting very high, even when we look back historically and start to make some comparisons. But I think you have to focus a little bit on what's causing it. So, right now, one of the big factors for sure that I'm seeing is the supply chain issue. That's got to be having an impact. Do I think that one's maybe the long-term one? Probably not. I think that's starting to wane. Like, we are seeing shipping costs actually going down, even though the time is still very delayed for getting stuff to out of port and moving. But I think the real area that needs to get the attention is actually housing, because that's where kind of worldwide right now we're seeing a huge increase there, and it's probably accounting for about 40%, I think, of the CPI number that we're seeing right now. So that's a pretty big component of that index. So housing has increased, and that's not just in one particular market. I think we're seeing that in a lot of areas. Some areas, of course, North America for sure, at a faster pace than like Japan or Europe.
You just you look at Vancouver and the house prices there and what it takes to just have a modest 2-bedroom house. It's just it's just staggering especially when you compare that's the house we have on the farm versus like how much money would you need to buy that similar house in some of the major cities like Toronto. It is pretty staggering. So from an investment standpoint, you kind of alluded to this at the beginning, is if I do have some money to invest, am I best just to keep on putting it into land, investing in the future? Or is it to look at other vehicles to try to diversify that? Or in this kind of inflationary environment, what do I do? How do I look at this?
Well, I think, because you're farming, you're obviously exposed to a couple of the areas that are going to probably benefit from this trend. But I'm also a believer in getting some money off farm. And if you have a surplus, which most producers have had a pretty decent 10-year run here, are starting to accumulate. So I think when you start to look in those areas, it's tough because that's so specific to how you're wired. And I think right now, if I look at the investment landscape and I kind of compare it to driving a car, I'm a believer in, if we're in a 100-kilometer zone, there are times when it's okay to drive 125K. And that would have been, we were really starting to push the gas, starting a little bit in February, but really March and April of 2020. So that's where, if somebody came in, I had a client that sold a business and they were wanting to get going, we were gas pedaling and moving them into the market fairly quickly. I think if that same occurrence was happening today, I'm definitely not, going 125 today. I'm probably starting to tap the brakes a little bit, and I'm probably slowing closer to a little over the speed limit or right around it right now, just because who would have expected, through this kind of COVID lockdowns and pandemic, that markets would have shrugged this off as well as they have. I mean, we've had a pretty decent run through this period here, which really you stop the economy in March of 2020 at almost a dead stop.
Yeah. So you
what are the
mentioned
comparisons to that? Like,
it's I don't know. Air travel stop is it's hard to come up with. So you mentioned earlier about you believe it's important to diversify or get some of that money out of the farm. Why do you think that? Why is that something to really consider strategically?
Well, I mean, if you are, if you're really just tied to your farmland and to a couple of different commodities, and you may be diversified, you may be growing, 7 or 8 different crops, you're still in a pretty narrow window, right? You're in Canada, you're in a very, specific sector. By diversifying, you can get exposure to those other sectors that really you're not tapping into right now. So things like technology, there's healthcare, things like that are very underrepresented, especially in Canada. But right now, when I look at the landscape, to me, it's actually very exciting because what are the scenarios? And you have to sort of sit back now and pencil them out. Are we going to see inflation kick in on wages a little greater here once the government starts to maybe wind down some of their supplement, the supplements that they've been kicking in? And I really think that's one that I'd be wanting to watch. And that does impact, farmers. Is you got wages are going to, if they start increasing, to me, that's a bit of a dangerous one, because that means that they'll have to start raising rates to pull things back here. And that could potentially stall out the economy. I don't think it's a high probability situation, but there's definitely a risk of that.
Yeah, higher rates. That's another thing that comes with an inflationary environment for sure. And trying to figure out. You mentioned the car analogy, trying to tap the brakes. That's really what the challenge is for the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve in the U.S. We will at some point know on the appointment or maybe possible reappointment of Chairman Powell in the U.S. That's there's a lot of factors there. When you think about a raising rate environment, we've seen some big forecasts from other banks. Is it like when we talk about like a 25-point increase here, 25-point increase there, it doesn't sound like a lot. But when you think about some, the consumer debt and, obviously a farm with an operating loan, like that adds up, right? Like it impacts the way that people use and spend their money.
Well, I read today that the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem is looking at a April of next year increase, and Canada will actually be probably one of the ones out of the gate fairly early. I don't think you'll see that in Europe or Japan. I think that'll be postponed until 2023, most likely. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't take a 2 or 3 point increase to probably start to have a bit of a dampening effect. And you were talking about speed limits. Do you remember when a number of years ago down in the States, Montana did away with speed limits?
Oh yeah, I remember.
This was back in this was in the mid 90s. I remember taking a trip and I drove obscenely fast, and it was pretty dangerous, frankly. I think I got to Great Falls from Lethbridge in like an hour and a half, which it's about a 3-hour trip usually. But if you take that, and that's really what the banks do when they do this quantitative easing, is they kind of say, here you go, just have at her. And I remember on that drive thinking, man, this is really fun. This is exhilarating, but there's still something that's almost a little bit off or wrong about it. And it's like, how long can this scenario last? Because we're almost fueling the fire a little bit by being as accommodative as we are. And so I think that when that gets reined in, there certainly will be some impact. And as always, it's probably not a bad idea to have a little bit of dry powder on hand so that you can take advantage of that. And if you're unsure, err by having a little bit more of a slower, methodical approach. But at the end of the day, you still got to drive. I see people that pull the car over and get out and quit driving. Well, no, you still got to stay, you got to stay committed. It's like if you have a bad year on the farm, your yields suck. You're not just going to go and, rent out the whole operation and shut her down. You're going to, go back to the board and, go back and figure out what you're going to grow and set up for next year.
Yeah, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I'm interviewing Dr. Jim Mintert from Purdue University. And we were talking about risk and, like unexpected events and just how you manage your farm business through that. And Jim kind of challenged me and he said, Shaun, you're talking about all of this like chaos in the negative. And he's like, for the producers that have working capital and they've got some of that powder dry as you talked, this is an opportunity. That's how you have to look at it. And I've never forgot that. And you once again reminded me of it when you mentioned the powder dry, because it's very, very true. If you prepare yourself for those, you don't know what the opportunity is, but at least if you have yourself set up financially to do it, you can like do it when you want to, right?
Well, I tell my clients that I actually struggle sleeping, and I'm the most nervous when the markets are roaring and doing well, because I'm trying to find out, peek around the corner, what's the next thing. And when it's the opposite way, like we were back in 2020 and early 2020, the sky's falling, there's chaos everywhere. Don't tell everybody, but I'm pretty excited to get in the day because, man, opportunity is abound. It reminded me of the cleansing that we had back in 08, 09. I mean, it was there was opportunity everywhere. But if you're a pessimist, you're usually always a pessimist. So you got to be careful. It's a slippery slope.
Yeah, I'm always interested in watching like the news, the business news channels, and there's like the perma bears or the perma bulls. It's like you're going to be wrong. Like you're not always right. Although the bulls have done pretty well historically here. Hey, Shaun, this has been fantastic. Thanks a lot for joining us here today on RealAg Radio. We got to do this again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, we're going to be right back on RealAg Radio with Ryan Reese from RBC Royal Bank. You're listening to RealAg Radio here at the Ag Excellence Conference, brought to you by RBC Royal Bank. And welcome back to RealAg Radio, broadcasting here today from the Agricultural Excellence Conference with Farm Management Canada. And today's sponsor is RBC Royal Bank. And it's now time to talk to Ryan Reese. He's the National Director for Agriculture for RBC Royal Bank. Hey, Ryan, how are you?
Good, Shaun. How are you?
Hey, man, I'm doing fantastic. And once again, thanks a lot for sponsoring our show here today with Farm Management Canada at AgEx. Very, very important conference. A lot of important discussions. Farm management, I know, is something that's important to RBC Royal Bank. And speaking of that, you got a big announcement today. This is the first time anybody has heard about this. So we're breaking news here this afternoon. What do you got for us?
Perfect. Well, if we're going to break news, it's going to be with you, Shaun. So appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Great to sponsor this important event. So yeah, we're really excited at RBC to talk to you today about the Foundations in Agricultural Management. It's a new course, e-learning course in partnership with the University of Guelph and FCC. So what it is, it's an ag-focused, self-driven e-learning course that really empowers farmers with the knowledge and confidence to take their farm or agribusiness to the next level. So the idea for pursuing this course was built off the success of the RBC McGill Personal Finance Essentials program we did a number of years ago. And we'll really follow a similar methodology. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. So the course will be delivered through a series of free of charge online video modules with additional supporting materials and will be for Canadian producers who are interested in enhancing their skills in farm management, all the while being taught by notable agriculture and business professors at the University of Guelph. Again, it's free of charge. It is for producers all across the country. And we launch on January 17th of this upcoming year. And we're really excited about it. And we're really excited to bring this to the industry.
And my understanding is it's on demand. So I take in the modules at when I have the time at my own pace. It's not something I need to go to the University of Guelph and be in a lecture hall.
That's exactly right, Shaun. Yeah. So, I mean, the main objective for the development of this course was to provide premium learning. So University of Guelph, it's a marquee university agricultural focused university in Canada, but really delivering it through modern delivery methods in order to make it accessible to any producer, regardless of where they reside in the country. So in speaking with many producers over the years, one of the biggest challenges with pursuing additional learning opportunities, and regardless of the topic, is simply accessibility. So often having to, travel, and that has associated costs and time. And you have to digest all this information in a crash course where you're bombarded with information, and it's really hard to retain long term. We know the days of crash studying for exams at university, right? So it's hard to retain. You take the exam and you forget it. But really with this, it allows the user to go back, retake a module if they like, go back to a certain topic that maybe they have a little more challenge with retaining, and have that supplementary material to review. And really the idea behind it as well is, you can take these learnings, demystify some concepts, and then go and talk to your various advisors that you may have and go a little deeper in certain areas. So again, we're really excited about bringing this to the industry. We're really happy to be partnering with the University of Guelph and FCC, both great partners on this initiative. And to tell you a little bit about the topics, just to get an idea of what we're covering, it's really, farmers are jacks of all trades. They have to manage it all, right? So we're really trying to focus on key skills necessary for producers to manage a farm operation. So things like strategy and business planning, financial literacy, HR management, succession planning, which is a major topic in our industry, risk management, and also a component on mental health, which increasingly is obviously becoming more and more important to focus on. So some really great skills and learning opportunities there. So at the end of the 8 modules, there'll be a test at the end of each module. Assuming you pass your test, you'll receive a nice certificate, branded with the University of Guelph, and something to be proud of, and maybe hang on your office wall, and it certainly will speak to the hard work you put into and taking that ownership of your learning journey and education journey. So again, we're excited. January 17th, certainly there'll be lots of material out there to make Canadian producers aware of it.
If somebody wants more information, Ryan, they're interested in maybe taking the course, how do they find it?
Yeah, so we'll again, this is the first launch. This is the first opportunity to hear about it. But in the new year, there'll be lots of ways to engage on that. There'll be different areas that we're marketing the course, and certainly very, very easy to sign up, and we'll build awareness around it for sure.
Okay, well, that's awesome stuff. Lots to look forward to there. Hey, Ryan, thank you so much for joining us here today on RealAg Radio at the AgEx conference, and thanks a lot for sponsoring today's show.
You bet. Thanks, Shaun.
When we come back on RealAg Radio, we've got more from the AgEx conference with Farm Management Canada. We're going to hear from Renee Wyatt. She's from Purdue University. We're going to talk about farm succession, that big topic that we continue to battle in our industry on both sides of the border. You're listening to RealAg Radio, Rural Radio 147, brought to you today by RBC Royal Bank. And welcome back to RealAg Radio. We're broadcasting today from the Agricultural Excellence Conference, and today's show is brought to you by RBC Royal Bank. Let's bring in our next guest, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. We're talking to Renee Wyatt. She's a research and extension specialist at Purdue University in their Purdue Institute for Family Business. Hey, Renee, how are you?
I'm great, Shaun. How are you?
Pretty good. Okay, so break that down. What exactly is that role? What are you doing?
Yeah, so I work with farms, I work with farmers, I work with family businesses as well. So I don't do the teaching part, but the other 2 missions of the land-grant university are where I fall. So extension, so that's where we disseminate research, we help farm families, we help people through the process of owning and managing and succeeding a family business or farm business, whatever that may be. And then the research side, where we try to dive in to help motivate the extension side.
Some very, very important work. Absolutely. And a lot of our audience here at the Ag Excellence Conference, but also on RealAg Radio, this issue of farm transition, farm succession, it's a tough one. We all talk about some of the horror stories of our neighbors. Maybe some of us personally went through one. It's a challenge. Why do you think this still is such a it's such a challenge for farm businesses in Canada and the US.
Yeah, so I just think farming is a very personal enterprise. When people are in a farm, it's typically because they were born into that farm, their family farm, there's that legacy component. And then once you're in that farm, it's hard to choose who's going to take it over, because that also means you're handing over some responsibility. And I'm sure that you've heard in Canada as well as the US, we have farmers say, well, I'm going to die on the tractor. And they're basically saying they don't want to hand it over, right? They're not ready mentally to hand it over, even if they're financially prepared. So that's part of my job too, right? To help motivate them if they are financially ready for succession, to help them get mentally prepared for succession, because that's a whole nother barrier to jump over.
Oh, absolutely. We're going to get to some of these barriers here in a little bit. Let's talk about the three parts of the succession process. You've really broke this down well. Let's go through all three.
Sure. So we basically have, like you said, three. We've got management, we've got ownership, and we've got the estate plan. So a lot of people, when they say, we've done our succession plan, they mean they've covered their estate plan. So they have their will in place, they've talked to their lawyer, and they have their taxes figured out. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have the management and the ownership parts figured out. Now, those two parts of the process, they can either, transfer concurrently, which they're in a stepwise process where they move together. They can happen asynchronously. So we can have some shares gifted here and there, with all of the shares transferring at death. And then management can go over, quite a long time. It just depends. But all of these can take quite a long time to happen. When we say management, we're really talking about handing down the day-to-day processes of the business and letting that next generation make some decisions that affect the farm. And ownership can be shares, it can be equipment, it can be grain bins, it can be land. That can look very different for each farm too.
Yeah, I'm interested in your opinion on this, that you mentioned sometimes those things, they happen together, and there seems to be this lack of, I don't know if it's acknowledgement, but they don't have to, and a lot of times it's like, okay, I'm done being involved in management, or I'm done being in operations, and that's when I give up any sort of ownership, and right. Those I think people kind of I think they give up on an opportunity where they can still be in management, but they can share ownership with some of those younger generations, so that there's this partnership period that allows for them to really kind of have a different experience. Do you know what I mean? Like how come that doesn't happen more?
So I don't know. So we actually, I'm an economist by training, right? And so I like to think about graphs. And so really ideally what we would see is a successor would start down here, in the employee role. And eventually they'd get to where they're like a co-manager maybe with the senior generation. And then eventually they would be the manager, right? And at the same time, the current owner, the senior generation, would start out here where they're the owner, they're the manager. They would maybe go to that co-ownership, role at some point. And then eventually they would still be on the management team, but maybe they'd be a consultant. So they're not out at 4 a.m. trying to fix a tractor. They're not deciding what fields get harvested. They're not making all of those management decisions, and they're serving as a consultant. And that's the best way we can see transition happen in farms.
Yeah, very well put. What about the estate plan as you mix that into both the management transition and the ownership transition? What are some things for people to think about there so this doesn't become an ugly process?
Yeah, so basically, we try to encourage people to basically, before they go to their lawyer and get that estate plan in place, to basically make sure that the goals and objectives of their farm that they currently have line up with that next generation. So we really encourage communication within the family before you're sitting in that lawyer's office and spending thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to work through some conflicts that you really just need to work out at your table at home. And so what we like to do is we encourage people to set those goals, say, here's what our farm is doing now. That senior generation says, to the junior generation, where do you want to take the farm? Where do you see the farm going? And how can we best set you up for that? Because maybe it's that they need to split the farm in two and make two different business entities. So each of the kids who are inheriting, have their own operation. If those kids don't work well together, forcing them to work together is probably going to force a sale, and that land might move out of ag, which is what we don't want. So communicating those goals before you spend thousands of dollars, but getting to that point where you're sitting down with your attorney, have a plan, have something laid out, and basically that estate plan just takes effect upon death, right? So that once you get it set, there's really no action items that you have other than updating it and make sure it makes sense.
Yeah, you mentioned the lawyer, the attorney. There's also the banker. There's the financial management. Like you really
right
to do this right. You need to kind of get the whole team together, and just the importance of them all working together to what the actual goals are of the stakeholders is sometimes doesn't happen, and that can also make this into a very, very lengthy process if you don't manage it appropriately.
Yeah, so we encourage farm families to have an advisory board, is what we call them. And basically, you want an attorney, you want a CPA. A lot of times you want an insurance agent. If life insurance is a factor in the estate plan, you can have your banker, you can have, people you trust in your community who have your best interest at heart. It is very advantageous to have them all at the table at the same time. Otherwise, your lawyer can come up with a beautiful plan that just sounds amazing, and then you run to your CPA and they say, do you know how much tax you're going to pay? And then you run back and then you run back, So it's nice to have all of those people sitting at the table at the same time to get perspectives, at the same time and get some opinions aligned so you can come up with the best plan possible. Because
all those people, Renee, are charging you by the hour. So
they are.
You got to remember that. You got to remember that. Now we've talked a little bit about the length that this process can sometimes take. I've heard numerous people talk about how you need to start this early. Don't wait till the older generation. Mom or dad is holding on to all the shares. They're 85. They're still trying to combine, and then maybe there's some health issues, and then you're trying to put all this package together. Work on this way earlier to try to avoid some pitfalls. I hear you agreeing with that.
Yeah. So some research done just among family businesses say that if you're going to transition the business within the family, it takes on average about 7 years. If you're going to transfer the business to someone outside of the family, so we'd call that like a non-kin transfer, those still take 3 to 4 years. And if you're going to completely liquidate the business, so say the farm is liquidated, we sell the assets, that can still take about 1.5 to 2 years. So we're talking about a long process, and that's on average. So a lot of these can be longer than that 7-year mark if we're talking intra-family succession.
That's where communication, it's an easy word to throw out there. It seems like kind of table stakes, but making sure that everybody's on the same page and is aligned. And so you're working towards that end goal, super critical because, you can just imagine if you're not on the same page, those times you gave us, they just sort of work their way longer and longer into the horizon.
Yeah. And what happens is, for that junior generation, if they're hanging on that farm, they're working long hours in the farm, they're pouring themselves into the farm. If there's a lot of ambiguity and they don't know what's going to happen, that can build a lot of resentment and cause a lot of resentment in a lot of those relationships. And eventually they can get to the point where they say, I'm going to find an off-farm job. And then the senior generation standing there saying, well, what? You were going to take over the farm? What's going on? Why are you looking for this other opportunity? And we tell them over and over, you didn't talk about it. You have to communicate those things to that generation so they know what they're working for.
Yeah, you bailed on us. We hung around so you could take it over, and nobody actually had, because what happens, we're going to get to the barriers after the break, but one of those barriers is lack of communication when it comes to the fact or just not willing to get started, right? Where after planting, after harvest, after Christmas, and all of a sudden it's 12 years later, 15, maybe even 25 years later, and nothing's been done. So it's and we both know lots of stories that have been like that.
Yeah, unfortunately.
We're going to change that, though. Absolutely. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. We are broadcasting here today from the Agricultural Excellence Conference with Farm Management Canada, and today's show is brought to you by RBC Royal Bank. And welcome back to RealAg Radio, broadcasting today from the Agricultural Excellence Conference with Farm Management Canada. And today's show is brought to you by RBC Royal Bank. Big thanks to RBC Royal Bank. They're also sponsors of the Mind Your Farm Business podcast, which I encourage you to check out as well. We're still continuing our conversation with Renee Wyatt. She's a research and extension specialist at Purdue University with their Purdue Institute for Family Business. Renee, we mentioned some of the barriers in the previous segment. I want to provide some more clarity to those because there is a lot of common barriers that come up as we try to figure out our farm transition plan. So let's run through those.
Sure. So one huge barrier to succession is not even knowing who's going to take over that farm. And so we conducted a family business succession survey, a farm business succession survey on Midwest farms, and only 28% of the businesses know who was going to take over that business in the next generation. So that means 72% don't know who's going to take over that business. And so that's a huge issue.
And that's why some farms are, because the answer to that may be, well, I don't have a kid that wants to come back. And that's why I've been hearing a little bit, and it's not super common yet, but more and more farms looking for, is there person that's been working on the farm that's maybe potentially interested, like some really kind of strategies for farm succession that we didn't hear about probably 15 years ago that people are having to wrap their head around at this point.
Yeah, so non-kin transfer is what we call that, but it is becoming more common. We actually tried to get a site set up called eFarmony where we could match these potential successors with non-kin, retiring farmers who might want to give a start to those beginning farmers, that weren't born into land and born into a farm, but still want to do that. So that's definitely a viable option. And we like to see that over liquidating because that potentially moves that farmland out of agriculture. And that's what we don't want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question about that. And, as one of the barriers we've seen in both Canada and the US, land prices escalate tremendously. Cost of equipment has escalated tremendously in a historical context. It's hard for somebody, if they did want to get into the industry, to, they were interested in it. It's to buy in is almost unfathomable unless you're mom and dad or hedge fund managers or something, right? You mentioned it,
right.
Born into land.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's huge. I mean, that's why you see so many of these kids who want to farm. They go into these sales positions maybe where they're able to talk to farmers and help them with their inputs and things like that, but they're not actually doing the farming. Or maybe, they have an off-farm job and then they're a farmhand where they actually get to do, get their hands dirty and get in the soil and things. So yeah, it's really hard to buy in or even start your own operation unless you start very, very small with equipment that's subpar, and then there's issues with that as well. So yeah, it's very hard to start.
Renee, is one of the greatest barriers the fact that people don't know how to start the process?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, we talk on campus at Purdue a lot of times with a lot of farm families who they come in and they're just at a loss. I mean, they have these healthy operations, they're doing great. They're just like, how do we bring in the next generation? How do we start that process? How do we do that? And we try to help them with that. But basically it comes down to communication, to trying to align those communication lines so that the senior generation, gets what they want out of the business. And the junior generation also the successor generation feels like they're welcome. And the junior generation needs to know what the senior generation needs out of that business, because financially, the people retiring maybe out of the management might still need to hold on to that ownership so they can still receive income from that land. Maybe they're still in a cash rent situation where they're, holding on to that asset to help them retire, so that the successor generation needs to know these things and be aware when they're planning.
Yeah. And if you don't communicate and you're not honest with each other, that's where the sort of like sub narratives begin. Mm-hmm. Oh, what you really want is you want me out of here. You want to boot me out. Like, no. Or, there's words are misinterpreted. It's really important, that communication process, that everybody just sort of takes a deep breath and listens to each other and is honest about what could really, really make this work.
Right. That's exactly right. And we encourage people to not have those talks at Thanksgiving or Christmas, to try to have those talks separate. We always say, don't have your farm family meeting before Christmas dinner. That's not a good idea. Have a separate meeting.
Well, this show is being broadcast on the day of U.S. Thanksgiving. So Renee brings up a good point. If you're all sitting around the Thanksgiving supper listening to RealAg Radio here, and you've started the conversation about succession, stop.
Yeah.
Don't go any further. That is good. You talked about some of the timelines traditionally from some of Purdue's research in terms of how long it takes for a farm business to transition. How does that compare to other industries where small business is involved?
Yeah, so a lot of these non-farm businesses that we work with, a lot of times they don't have as heavy in assets. So it's a little bit easier to transition that to the next generation. They don't have as large of a buy-in. Maybe the successor generation needs to bring $15,000 to the table or something to buy in, versus these farm operations where we're talking about millions of dollars worth of land, millions of dollars worth of assets, in your grain bins, in your operations, in your livestock, in your equipment. Farms are just so asset heavy, and that just makes it so much slower to transition. We've seen it over and over. These farms are they're multi-million-dollar operations at this point, even if they're not, necessarily larger than the average farm in their county or their area.
Yeah. So how do you set it up though? Because like in a regular sense, you'd say, well, the younger generation should work hard and they can buy in over time, and they can earn their way in, and so that, based on the dollar sizes, is easier said than done. So what kind of strategies are you seeing at Purdue as you talk to different farms on how they're kind of managing what a transition process could look like?
Yeah, so a lot of times we have, the retiring or the senior generation where they basically just hold on to that land asset where they still own that asset. So they're getting that cash rent or that 50-50, however they have that structured. They're still receiving that income, but they're able to step away from the management piece and let the junior generation take on that management piece. So the junior generation might be getting more of the returns from the land as far as the crop and things, but the senior generation is still getting some income from that. That's a good way that we've seen it done. Some of the really large farms that we see, they have shares. And you can slowly be gifted shares. We see that a lot. Yep. Where farm kids are gifted shares. That's a good way for them to start owning more of the operation without having to write a check. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. You just have to be strategic about it so that people can afford it. Yeah.
The one barrier we have not talked about yet, sure, and I can't believe it took this long for us to get to it, is these off-farm siblings. They've got different ideas than maybe some of the on-farm kids. How should they be dealt with?
Yeah, so we talk a lot to farm families about this as well. So in an ideal situation, there would be farm assets, and then there'd maybe be some non-farm assets. So maybe there'd be, the parents would own a house or have some kind of retirement funds. Maybe they have, a condo in Fiji. We don't know, but there's these non-farm assets that these off-farm siblings can kind of, have. Yeah. And then the farm siblings who have put in all the sweat equity, as we hear about, they can take over the farm itself. It honestly is a case-by-case basis on how you break that down. The big thing that we see is as long as the senior generation is transparent on their plan, so everyone knows what's going to happen and why, it's a lot easier pill to swallow than sitting at the table after mom and dad have passed and saying, well, here's what it is. And then you can't ask questions, right? So that's why that communication and plan is early and better.
Yeah. Your caveat though there, as you're saying it, that always doesn't work out, where we're trying to avoid surprises at the end of the day, where I thought this, or I was told this. I was just you mentioned sweat equity. I was just going to bring up that, just relying on your sweat equity of 10, 20, 30 years, that you just don't rely on that. The empty promise of, hey, one day, if you just work hard, one day this will all be yours, and nothing is actually ever agreed to or written down. That is dangerous territory for the on-farm sibling.
It is. And I mean, a lot of so we talk to students on campus a lot, right? We've got these 20-something-year-olds and they're near graduation. They think, oh, I'm going to go back and I'm going to manage that business. I'm going to take over the farm. I'm going to manage. And we say, okay, well, your parents are 55, right? And their parents are still managing the business for them.
Yeah.
So you might have 30, 40 years before you get to actually manage that business. Is that okay? And then they sit back and think, whoa, maybe I'll start off farm and then go back into the farm eventually, but it's an eye opener and it's hard for them to grapple with that sometimes.
Yeah. Well, if you're going to put it that way, I don't know if I want to do that.
That's exactly right.
Oh, if you're going to put it that way. Renee, we're almost out of time here. Any last things that you want the RealAg Radio audience to consider as they think about really having a successful farm transition process?
Sure. So we just want to encourage family farms, to keep the business strong enough and healthy enough to last into the next generation, but to also continue that healthy family. Because, when you're saying, would we rather have the family or the farm, you want both. And so they have to make sure that both systems are healthy to pass on and continue to that next generation.
Well put. Without one or the other, like it's, you can have a really successful business, but if the family part is destroyed, it kind of makes it pretty tough for everybody to enjoy some of those fruits. So very good advice there at the end. Renee, thank you so much for joining us here today on RealAg Radio and participating in our show here at the AgEx conference.
Well, thank you so much, Shaun. I appreciate it.
That was Renee Wyatt. She's a research and extension specialist at Purdue University with her Purdue Institute for Family Business. Whew, great show brought to you today by RBC Royal Bank. Appreciate everybody that participated in today's show. We got some great financial advice from Shaun Haas of RBC Dominion Securities earlier in the show. Really do appreciate that. And Ryan Reese from our RBC as well that joined us. If you have any feedback on today's show, you can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Of course, you can also find us on social media, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We are there as Real Agriculture, or you can call the RealAg listener line. All you do is dial 855-776-6147, press the number 3, and leave me a message. Big thanks to our sponsor today, RBC Royal Bank and Farm Management Canada, for having us here as a part of the program. Thanks everybody for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Radio, and we'll chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.